were still laughing when she wheeled the cleaning cart past them. "Honestly, how long does it take to wipe down one counter?" Kelsey Drummond said, loud enough that 3 other people at the nursing station turned to look. She was 26, freshly promoted to charge nurse, and had the kind of confidence that hadn't been tested yet. "I've been waiting 15 minutes. The woman pushing the cart didn't respond. She adjusted her grip on the handle, moved toward the counter, and began unpacking her supplies with the same unhurried patience she brought to every room on the 7th floor. Her name tag read Loretta. Her last name, if anyone had thought to look closer, was Ashby. "This is why I don't understand why they keep her on," said Kelsey, dropping her voice just enough to feel polite. "She's sweet, sure, but sweet doesn't clean a biohazard spill in under 40 minutes. Beside her, Darren Fitch. Second-year resident, broad-shouldered, the kind of person who laughed at other people's jokes 2 seconds after everyone else to make sure it was safe, shrugged. Administration keeps her around. Union thing, probably. "She's been here longer than the MRI machine," added Priscilla Tam, another nurse, without looking up from her chart. They weren't cruel people, exactly. That was the thing about this particular kind of cruelty. It rarely came from cruelty at all. It came from the assumption that certain people couldn't hear or didn't matter enough to bother lowering your voice for. Loretta Ashby wrung out her cloth over the utility sink. She was 58 years old, 5'3", with close-cropped silver hair and hands that had been dry and cracked every winter since she was 40. She wore the same dark green uniform the rest of the housekeeping staff wore. She clocked in at 6 a.m. and clocked out, most days, sometime after 3. She had worked at Hargreaves Medical Center in Guelph, Ontario, for 22 years. Almost nobody on the 7th floor knew what almost nobody in the entire building knew, except for the board of directors, the CFO, and the 2 lawyers who had drafted the original incorporation papers back in 1998, was that Loretta Ashby was also the majority shareholder and co-founder of Ashby Crane Health Group, a private holding company that owned Hargreaves Medical Center outright, along with 4 other hospitals and 2 long-term care facilities across southern Ontario. Hadn't told anyone, not the new CEO, not the department heads, not the union reps who sometimes stopped to ask how she was doing. She came in. She cleaned. She listened. And she had been listening for quite some time. It had started the previous autumn. Though, if Loretta were being honest, the real beginning was further back than that. Back to the board meeting in September, where she had sat at the head of a glass table in a suit that cost more than some of her employees made in a month. And listened to 3 different department managers tell her that staff morale across the Guelph site was excellent and consistently strong. Had nodded. She had thanked them. She had driven home, changed into her late husband's old cardigan, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Harold had always said the problem with owning things was that people performed for you. You walked into a room, and the room performed. You asked a question, and you got a performed answer. He had learned that the hard way when they opened their first clinic together in 1997, a walk-in on Stone Road, 20 chairs, and a photocopier that jammed every other Tuesday. Back then, they had no staff to perform for them. They just had patients and problems and a very honest picture of what wasn't working. Harold had been gone for 6 years now. The clinics had become a medical center. The medical center had become a group, and somewhere in the expansion, Loretta had started to lose the honest picture. In October, without telling anyone except her daughter Wren and her accountant, she had taken a housekeeping position at Hargreaves. Same building she technically owned. Same 7th floor she had approved the renovation budget for in 2019. She wore her uniform, signed her name as Loretta A., and started at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. First week, she thought, maybe the board was right. People seemed decent enough. The unit clerk on 7, a young man named Toby, always moved his bag off the extra chair so she could wheel her cart past the nursing station without having to ask. The second week, she started to see the other thing. It wasn't any single dramatic incident. It was smaller than that and more persistent, and in some ways harder to witness because of it. It was the way Kelsey Drummond spoke about the cleaning staff in the staff lounge, not with hatred, exactly, but with a casual dismissal that was almost worse, like they were furniture that occasionally moved on its own and needed to be redirected. It was the way Darren Fitch had once, in her direct presence, complained about the smell of those industrial cleaners to a colleague, while Loretta was actively spraying down the counter 2 feet away from him. He had not lowered his voice, had not looked at her. To him, she simply wasn't there in any way that required acknowledgement. It was the afternoon. A patient's family member had dropped a full coffee cup in the main corridor on 7. An accident, clearly, and the woman had been mortified. And a cluster of staff had stood watching from the nursing station while Loretta got on her knees to mop it up, and someone, she never saw who, had laughed softly and said, "At least she's good for something." Had been on her knees. Her left knee had been bothering her for weeks, the old bursitis flaring up from the cold floor and the repetitive motion. She had pressed her cloth to the tile and worked methodically, corner to center, the way Harold had taught her to. Harold, who had mopped floors himself at a Loblaws in Brampton every weekend for 3 years to help pay for medical school, and silk. She had thought about him then and about the particular indignity of a world that sorted people by what they carried in their hands. They had not said anything. She had finished cleaning the floor. She had gone to the supply closet, sat on an overturned bucket for 4 minutes, and then gone back to work. But she had started keeping notes. A small black notebook, the kind you could buy at any Staples, kept in the front pocket of her cleaning cart, under a folded cloth. She didn't write names at first, just observations. Staff laughed while patient in 714 was in distress. Housekeeping asked to re-clean room that had already been inspected and signed off. No valid reason given, seems punitive. Charge nurse referred to housekeeper as the cleaning lady to patient, corrected when patient asked her name. By December, she had filled 31 pages. Kelsey Drummond had a talent for making people feel small without ever raising her voice. Loretta had watched her do it to the dietary aides, to the newer nurses, a student doing her placement who had made the mistake of asking a clarifying question in front of the team. Kelsey never yelled. She just deployed a particular kind of slowness, a patient, deliberate pause before answering, as though the question had been almost too simple to dignify, and let the silence do the work. Had done it to Loretta directly in November, in front of 4 other people. It was about a patient room, 709, that had been flagged for a deep clean following a discharge. Loretta had cleaned it according to protocol, documented it, and moved on. 2 hours later, Kelsey had appeared at the supply closet with a printout. "Room 709 needs to be redone," she said. "There's streaking on the window, and the bathroom sink wasn't properly wiped." "I cleaned that room at 11:15, Loretta said. "I can show you the log." Kelsey's expression didn't change. "I'm not disputing that you were in the room. I'm saying it wasn't done properly. I followed the full protocol." Another pause, that pause. "I think," Kelsey said, with the careful diction of someone choosing every word to mean something else, "that maybe the standards are a little different now than when you started, and it can be hard to keep up. I'm happy to have someone walk you through the new checklist." There were 2 dietary aides behind Kelsey, a unit clerk, a 3rd-year medical student who had the decency to look at his shoes. Loretta said, "I'll go look at the room." Went and looked at the room. The window was fine. The sink was fine. She cleaned them again anyway, documented it again, and said nothing. That night she sat at her kitchen table, and called Wren. "Mom," her daughter said, from her apartment in Vancouver, after listening for a long time without interrupting. "Why are you still going back?" Wasn't really a question. "Because I haven't seen enough yet," Loretta said. "I've been there 4 months. You've seen plenty. I haven't seen what happens when someone good is in that position. I only know what goes wrong. I need to know if anyone makes it go right." Wren was quiet for a moment. "Is anyone?" Loretta thought about Toby, the unit clerk, who moved his bag without being asked. She thought about an older staff physician named Dr. Yoon, who had stopped her in the hallway last week to tell her, unprompted, that the 7th floor looked particularly clean lately and that he'd noticed and appreciated it. I thought about a young nurse named Adiazi. No, wait, she needed a new name. She couldn't use that. A young nurse named Comfort, who had once quietly picked up a wet cloth that had fallen off Loretta's cart, handed it back to her, and said, "Here you go," with a simple warmth that should not have been remarkable and somehow was. "1 or 2 people," she said. "That's not enough." "Oh," Loretta agreed, "it's not, but it's where I start." January brought an ice storm that kept half the city inside for 3 days and sent the other half to emergency departments across the region. The 7th floor ran at 112% capacity. Everyone was exhausted, and exhaustion, Loretta had noticed, was when people's real selves showed up most clearly. Kelsey was worse. She snapped at Toby for a scheduling error that hadn't been his fault, then denied having snapped when Toby gently mentioned it to the shift supervisor. Darren Fitch started referring to the housekeeping staff collectively as the cleaning crew, in the way that someone says the furniture, not a slur, just an absence of personhood. But Comfort, the young nurse, got better. She was working double shifts and still stopped to hold the elevator for a dietary aide struggling with an oversized cart. She was still using people's names. When a patient in 7111 became confused and distressed and started calling out in the middle of the afternoon, Comfort was the one who went in and sat with him for 20 minutes, holding his hand and talking quietly, when it was, strictly speaking, not her task. Loretta wrote Comfort's name in her notebook, not on the observation pages, on a separate clean page near the back. Notebook had 2 sections by February. The front was what she'd come to think of as the account, a careful log of what had happened, to whom, when, and who had been present. The back was something else, a short list of names. People who had, in small and sometimes invisible ways, decided to be decent when no one required it of them. There were 6 names on that list by the time March came around. Toby was there. Dr. Yuen was there. Comfort was there. A housekeeping colleague named Wan Jiru, who had been quietly doing the work of covering for 2 chronically understaffed floors without complaint and without anyone noticing. A patient transport aide named Felix, who remembered the names of every regular patient he moved through the building, and a dietary supervisor named Preethi, who had twice caught errors in patient meal orders that could have caused real harm, and had reported them quietly and correctly and without making anyone feel stupid. 6 names. Against 31 pages of notes. Had planned to step back in April. Present her findings to the board. Recommend a full operational and cultural review. Hand off to the new HR leadership she'd been quietly recruiting since the fall. What moved the timeline up was a Tuesday in late March. Loretta had been in the supply closet reorganizing the floor buffer cables when she heard voices in the adjacent utility corridor. She recognized Kelsey's voice first, then Darren's, then a third person she placed after a moment as one of the supervisors from the nursing administration office, a woman named Bridget, though she would need to use a different name now in the account, so she noted her in the notebook as Subject C. We're talking about the housekeeping staff. Specifically, they were talking about Loretta. She's slow. She's been slow for years, and there's no way around it, Kelsey was saying. The union makes it impossible to push back, but honestly, at this point, it's a liability question. If a room she's cleaned comes back flagged again. Room didn't actually fail inspection, said the third voice, cautiously. Ed, I flagged it. Right, but in terms of the formal. I flagged it, Kelsey said again with that particular flatness. That's on record. And if we build a consistent record, then we have something to work with. It takes time, but it's doable. Loretta stood very still in the supply closet, was listening to a plan, a deliberate, patient, methodical plan, to document her out of a job using fabricated performance concerns. Was 58 years old. She had mopped this floor for 5 months. She had bad knees and cracked hands and a small black notebook in her cart. As she took it out, she wrote down the date, the time, and a summary of what she had just heard. Then she called her lawyer. Board meeting was held on a Thursday, 2 weeks later, in the same glass-walled room where Loretta had once sat and heard that morale was consistently strong. She arrived wearing a suit, charcoal gray, well-cut, the same one she'd worn to Harold's funeral and to the closing of their second acquisition, and to the meeting where they'd signed the papers on Hargreaves. She set her bag on the table. She set the black notebook beside it. A CEO, a man named Gordon Ash, who had been in the position for 14 months, looked at the notebook, then at her, and did not immediately understand what he was seeing. A CFO understood first. She had known Loretta for 11 years. Board has asked me to present findings from an operational review of the Guelph site, Loretta said. I conducted the review directly, over 5 months, from the inside. The room was quiet. I want to be clear about something before we begin, she said. This is not primarily a performance review. It's a culture review. And culture, in my experience, starts and ends with how a building treats its most invisible people. That is how you actually know what kind of place you're running. Open the notebook to the first page. What followed over the next 6 weeks was, from the outside, a fairly standard organizational restructuring. There were departures. Kelsey, Drummond, resigned the week after the review findings were shared with department heads, before any formal process could begin. Darren Fitch received a formal documented conversation and an 18-month performance plan. The nursing administration supervisor was reassigned to a different site. New patient experience and staff culture policy was implemented across all 5 Ashby Crane hospitals, requiring annual third-party reviews. Outside, it looked like a policy change. Inside, people who had worked on the 7th floor for a long time said it felt different, slowly, then steadily. The way a room feels after someone has opened a window. Obi was offered a newly created role as Patient Experience Coordinator, with a salary increase and a proper job description for the things he had already been doing. He accepted. Comfort received a commendation letter, co-signed by the CEO and the chair of the board. She also received a mentorship placement with a nurse practitioner program that Ashby Crane was funding. She read the letter twice before she believed it. Anjuru, the housekeeping colleague who had been quietly covering 2 understaffed floors for 18 months, received a formal acknowledgement of her workload, back pay for overtime that had not been properly classified, and a team lead title that came with 3 new staff members and a real budget. When Gordon Ash asked Loretta, in a private meeting, how she wanted him to communicate this to the staff, what the official explanation would be for the review and its origins, she thought about it for a moment. Tell them the truth, she said. That someone was paying attention. And if they ask who, they can ask me directly, she said. I'll be in the building. Looked at her. You're planning to come back. Not in housekeeping, she said. I'll be on site in an advisory capacity, but yes, I intend to be in that building. Yes, she paused. I want people to know that the person who cleaned their floors is the same person who owns them. I think that matters. I think it should be harder to forget. On her last day in uniform, Loretta Ashby pushed her cart down the 7th floor corridor one final time. It was early, not quite 7, and most of the staff hadn't come in yet. The floor was quiet in the particular way that hospitals are quiet in the early morning. Not empty, exactly, but still, holding its breath. She stopped at the window at the far end of the hall. Outside, Guelph was just coming awake under a pale April sky, the last of the winter brown giving way at the edges to something that might become green. Thought about Harold. She thought about the walk-in clinic on Stone Road, the photocopier that jammed, the 20 chairs. She thought about what he used to say, that the point of building something wasn't the building. The point was the inside of the building, what it felt like to be a person inside it. As she had spent 22 years learning what it felt like to be a person inside Hargreaves Medical Center. Now, she knew. I wheeled the cart back to the supply closet, parked it neatly, removed her name tag, and left it on the shelf. Downstairs, in a parking spot marked reserved, board use only, her car was waiting. It always parked somewhere else these past 5 months. Let the spot sit empty. Let whoever glanced at it wonder. She drove out of the lot, turned onto Stone Road, and headed home. Behind her, on the 7th floor, the morning shift was starting. People were arriving. Someone was laughing about something. Someone else was filling a coffee cup. And somewhere in the building, somewhere in the ordinary machinery of a place that had quietly, fundamentally changed, a young nurse named Comfort was pulling on her ID badge, checking the board, and beginning her rounds with the particular calm of someone who had recently been reminded that being decent was not invisible. It was, in fact, the thing most likely to be seen. I keep thinking about the moment Loretta was on her knees, cleaning a spill she didn't cause, while someone nearby laughed softly and said, "At least she's good for something." And she just kept working, corner to center, the way she'd been taught. Didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't quit. She went to the supply closet, sat on an overturned bucket for 4 minutes, and then went back out. That's not weakness. I used to mistake that kind of stillness for defeat. I don't anymore. What Loretta understood, and what took me a long time to really sit with, is that how you respond when no one is watching you, when no one owes you anything, when the situation is genuinely unfair and you know it, that's the truest measure of who you are. Not your title, not your bank account, not what happens when things are going well. Real shape of a person shows up in a cold corridor at 6 in the morning when your knee is aching. And someone who doesn't know what they're talking about is explaining your job to you. What struck me most about Kelsey wasn't the cruelty. It was the carelessness. She wasn't some movie villain. She was just someone who had never been asked to look carefully at the people around her and had decided, quietly and without much thought, that some people didn't need to be looked at. That's how most harm actually happens. Not through malice. Through the comfortable decision not to pay attention. And Comfort, whose name I keep coming back to. She didn't do anything dramatic. She held an elevator. She used people's names. She sat with a confused patient for 20 minutes when it wasn't technically her job. She wasn't performing goodness for anyone who could reward her for it. That's the part that matters. The integrity of an act that no one is grading. Heirs. Something I've come to believe, and Loretta's story just makes it clearer for me. The 3 things that actually determine the shape of a life are how honestly you think, how consistently you do right by people, and how long you're willing to keep going when the situation gives you every reason to stop. Intelligence without integrity becomes clever justification for bad behavior. Integrity without clear thinking becomes good intentions that cause damage anyway. And both of those things without the sheer stubbornness to keep showing up. They don't amount to much when it actually gets hard. Loretta had all three. She observed carefully and honestly, without letting anger distort what she was seeing. She treated people decently in both directions. She documented the harm, yes, but she also noticed Toby and Comfort and Wanjiru. She saw the whole room, not just the parts that confirmed what she already felt. And she kept going for 5 months with bad knees and a small black notebook, because she believed the inside of that building mattered, and that someone needed to know the truth of it. What stays with me is something her late husband Harold apparently believed: that the point of building something isn't the building, it's what it feels like to be a person inside it. I think about that a lot. In workplaces, yes, but also in families, in friendships, in the small institutions we build every day just by how we choose to treat people when it costs us nothing to be careless. A question is always the same. What does it feel like to be someone inside the thing you're building?